One of the things that made a lot of people think that America and the free enterprise system and private property caused environmental problems was the fact that the vast wildlife herds and bounty of flocks of birds and big herds of buffalo and elk and deer and the rivers that were just choked thick with salmon and other anadromous fish when the first colonists arrived in the United States. And then to see over 200 years, to see most of these species, many of these species at least, vanish or have their populations reduced into teeny numbers, gave the idea that capitalism was the source of these problems. But if you look carefully at what happened, it's just the opposite of that. When the first colonists arrived in America, there were perhaps as many as 100 million buffalo roaming across the plains of the United States and even coming east as far as Washington, D.C. By the 1900s, most of the buffalo had just about disappeared. They came very, very close to going extinct. And at the same time, herds of cattle began to increase across the country. And now there are as much as 100 million head of cattle in the United States. Now, what can you learn from that? Wild species were essentially unowned. Nobody owned them, and there was little way initially for people to own them. But the cattle were owned by people, and so people took care of them and made sure that they multiplied and that there was a bounty of them able to feed the people and supply their needs. And this is one of the things that you learn about wildlife. When the United States created its own wildlife law, one of the things they did, which was rather unique, they decided they were going to reject the wildlife systems that had been used in Europe. And in those systems, the law essentially said that wildlife belongs to the landowner on whose land it occurs. One of the things that they decided in this country was that we're overthrowing the old world. We're overthrowing the old system. We think that wildlife should belong to everybody. And one of the things that happened, American wildlife populations began to fall as if hit by a plague. Since it was treated as an open commons, everybody had a strong incentive to go out and get all the wildlife they could before somebody else did. And this led to the overuse of all the wildlife. One of the things that was very common in the United States was salmon coming up all the streams from on down through Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. There was such a mass of salmon that would migrate up the rivers to spawn at various times of the year that these salmon were harvested in vast numbers and fed to people continuously. Now what happened, of course, with everybody harvesting these salmon year after year after year, nobody owning them, nobody having any incentive to take care of them or take care of the habitat they were in. The rivers were also used as sewers to dump all kinds of waste in. Logs were floated down all these rivers. It was the easiest way to get logs from a forest down to the coast where there would be sawmills. And all these various uses began to destroy the quality of the water, and the salmon began to disappear. But one of the interesting things, in England and in Iceland and in parts of Norway, the landowners actually own the exclusive right to fish along various streams. Because the salmon was a very valuable resource, they took very good care of this. They made sure that people didn't come in and pollute and that people didn't come in and overfish. And they set the regulation. They would all band together, all these different landowners, and created an association. And then if they found somebody that was dumping pollutants into the water, that was destroying the quality of water, that was harming the salmon, the association as a whole would go to court and sue, first to get an injunction to force whoever was doing the polluting or harming the stream and the salmon to stop doing the harm they was doing, and then also to collect damages. And to this day, they still have thriving salmon populations in those countries. But you look at the eastern United States and even up into some of the maritime provinces, and the salmon populations have disappeared. Essentially, there are next to no salmon left on the Atlantic coast of the United States. And again, this was a classic example of the tragedy of the commons. And the way to resolve that is to find a way to allow ownership. I mean, the basic problem that we have in this country is that we still have this belief that it's ownership of something that causes the problems or utilization of something that causes the problems. And that's not so at all. I mean, the problem has been the lack of property rights, the lack of ownership that has caused our wildlife to disappear, while wildlife in other countries, particularly in Britain and parts of Europe, is thriving under a system of ownership and utilization.